And now again, I'm so privileged to have Robert Heath with me this morning, and that he agreed to preach when I asked him. I know he'll bless you. Bless you, Rob.
Good morning, everybody, and I want to thank Lori for having me and for all of you all for allowing me to come and speak with you today. The scripture lesson today comes from the book of Matthew, the 22nd chapter, the 35th through the 40th verses, and it reads, "And one of them, an expert in the law, tested him with this question: 'Teacher, which is the greatest commandment in the law?' And Jesus replied, 'Love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the first and the greatest commandment. And the second is like it: love your neighbor as yourself. All the law and the prophets hang on these two commandments.'" And if you would pray with me. Lord God, please allow the words of my mouth and the meditations of my heart to be pleasing in your sight, and to be a blessing to all those who may hear. In Christ's name, amen. Now, this verse and this story is repeated in the books of Mark in the 12th chapter and the books of Luke in the 10th chapter. And one of the interesting things to think about is the time that Jesus was speaking these words was a lot like the time that we're dealing with now. There was a lot of fear. There was a lot of anxiety in Israel at the time. There was an occupying army that was governing. There was tension between the various religious scholastic groups. There was racial and cultural inequities that, perceived or real, caused dynamic tension in the land. And during that time, Jesus explained that the two most important commandments were to love God and to love your neighbor as yourself. Now, one of the interesting things in the Luke version of this story actually precedes the telling of the story of the Good Samaritan. And that story was because after Jesus gave this answer to the scholar, he asked the second question, which is, well, Lord, who is our neighbor? And the implicit kind of question that went along with that was, and how should we love them? And in the story of the Good Samaritan, what Jesus was able to do was to answer that question, to answer both of those questions with one answer. And that was, our neighbors are those to whom we show mercy. And we love them by the mercy that we show. Now, in our country today, many of us are overwhelmed. There is so much to deal with. We've got a global pandemic and a potential recession. Many people losing their jobs and out of work. And add to that the protests and the deaths and the enmity that's going on between communities. There's so much to consider. Isn't it enough to just be a good person anymore? Why do we have to fix everything? Why is it not okay to not be a racist? Why do I have to be anti-racist, is what some people are wondering. Why can't we just treat everybody equally? Why should we have to deal with all this? And I mean, can you fix racism anyway? Won't there always be racism? Well, I don't believe that there always will be. But I don't want you to just take my word for it. I hope that I can show you through my story a way to a brighter day, and a way to learn how to love your neighbor, even in the midst of chaos and fear. So, part one of my story I call the American Dream. You see, I come from a family where I had both a father and a mother. My father served in the Army, and I was able to live in Germany for 3 years while I was in elementary school. I was actually able to skip 5th grade, and I graduated high school, beat all of the statistics for a young black man in the 90s, and entered the University of Illinois as a 16-year-old freshman. I then went on to graduate with a BA in economics, a BA in speech communications, while also having studied abroad in Costa Rica and earned a minor in Spanish, all of this by the age of 21. I earned my master's degree 2 years later in teaching with a 3.8 GPA. And I taught for 6 years in Tennessee. I then attended the University of Illinois College of Law, a top 30 law school at the time, and served as a teaching assistant, editor of the Business Law Review. I graduated with honors and served as the Dean's Fellow after graduation. During and after law school, I served as an officer in the United States Marine Corps for a total of 8 years. I set records as a litigator, and I received the Navy Marine Corps Commendation Medal for my leadership as a company commander. I now run a leadership development consulting firm that helps businesses learn how to lead their teams in such a way that they are able to optimize performance and get the best out of their people. I live in the pleasant town of Allenville, Michigan. My wife, who is white, and my children, who are biracial, are accepted in our community. And all of my white family members and my neighbors treat me with dignity and respect. Now, if this was all you knew of my story, you would say that I'm living the American dream. And you would be right. Now, you might think that my life is an example of how race and racism are not a factor in America anymore. And if that was your thought, you would be wrong. You see, as recent events have shown us, that's not necessarily the case. So now I want to tell you a little bit about the other part of my story, which I call the American Nightmare, and how it helped me to learn the lesson that we are discussing today. You see, my family is originally from Tunica, Mississippi, in the Deep South, by way of Memphis, Tennessee. My grandparents were raised in Chicago, where my parents were also born and raised, and where I was also born and spent the majority of my childhood there in the Northwest Indiana area. Growing up, I was often afraid of being beat up or even killed by the police, or of being in the wrong neighborhood, the wrong white neighborhood, at the wrong time, or being caught by the KKK and lynched. Now, you might think that I had this fear because of the sensational accounts that the media pumps into our homes, as some people tell it. But you see, I was born in 1979. The TV media that was pumped into our homes when I grew up taught me, like it taught many other Americans, to be afraid of black people. Even though over 95% of African Americans, just like our white counterparts, are law-abiding citizens. So where did I get my fear of the cops and the angry white people from? Well, remember, I told you my family history and how we were from the Deep South. Well, in my family, I have a great-grandfather who fought for freedom in World War II and then came home to a segregated America. My grandmother was childhood friends with a young man by the name of Emmett Till. Yes, that Emmett Till. And then she never saw him again after he was murdered on a trip down to visit his family in Mississippi. My father was harassed multiple times and once robbed by members of the Chicago police as a teenager. He's never been in jail or arrested, by the way. In my own life, by the time I was 21, I had been pulled over more than 10 times before receiving my first ticket for speeding, which I got when I was 21. And no, in any of those other times, I had not received any warnings. I had not done anything wrong. I was simply questioned as to whose car this was and why I was in this neighborhood and then released. And while we sometimes thought that we were safe in the North, we were reminded often by some of our more helpful white classmates that Indiana, where I went to high school, had boasted nearly 30% of white men in the state being members of the Klan during its resurgence in the years before the Great Depression. You see, I went to high school from the year of the Rodney King verdict and the riots that followed, to the year of the OJ verdict and the discord that followed. During that time, my parents had the same talk with me that millions of black families have with their children every year. The same talk that I now am having to have with my children. The talk that explains to us how we have to be careful when we leave the home. Because even though we follow the rules and are respectful, the people that we encounter may not know us. What they will know is that we resemble what they have been taught, sometimes by their parents, oftentimes by society, to fear. And that fear can get us hurt or killed. Moral of the story, I was a young black man, and therefore I was dangerous just by being. It was okay, and it made sense for women to clutch their purses when I walked by. It was okay that store owners watched me like a hawk. It made sense. It was okay that police stopped me just to check my credentials when I'm parked outside my friend's house waiting for him to come down. Why? Of course, because I'm a threat. I fit the description. And so, I learned how to make white people feel comfortable around me. I learned to be a man that was not threatening. I smiled and spoke early to remove any doubt and any alarm. I was extra polite, even to people that were rude to me. I made sure that every time I was pulled over, I was respectful and non-threatening, even when my friends and I were asked to get out of our car and were searched while on our way home from Wednesday night Bible study. You see, this was a night that I didn't listen to my parents, and I carried more than their recommended 2 black people in the car with me. We had just dropped off our youth pastor, and I was dropping off my other friends when we were pulled over. Now, what made this night interesting was the fact that when we were pulled over, I had stopped at the stop sign and saw the unmarked police car. I didn't know there was a police car at the time, but I saw the unmarked police car at the stop sign. And I waved them through because they had stopped first. And they waved me through and told me to go on ahead. And so I continued to drive. They pulled behind us and pulled us over. Now, while my officer was rather nice, the others that he and his partner called in for backup were not so nice to my passengers. They were roughly pressed up against the car and searched as if we had done something wrong. And no, they were not being disrespectful or resisting in any way. As a matter of fact, as the officer was walking up to the car when Mia got pulled over, I gave them all the evil eye and made them promise rather, to be on their best behavior. You see, I understood what could happen in that situation. I remember saying to them something like, if you do anything that makes them angry or puts us in danger, if they don't kill you, I will. But I digress. These experiences left me wondering what it truly meant to be black, to be a black man in America. And when I went to college, I went on a journey to discover what it meant to be a black man in America, and more importantly, what it meant to be a man. Now, on this journey, I learned many things. I learned that there was African history, even West African history, before slavery. I learned that much of what was called science and scholarship in Europe and America during the 18th and 19th centuries was not necessarily that, especially when it related to anthropology and to history. I learned about Mansa Musa and the Mali Empire and the wealth that he had, thought to be the richest man in the world in the 13th century. I learned about how the Moors ruled much of southern Europe during the quote-unquote Dark Ages, and how much of the history of their influence on European culture and education was destroyed during the Inquisition and the resurgence of the Christian kings in Europe right around the time of Columbus's voyage to America. I learned about the principles upon which our nation was founded and how they were principles that had been passed down through centuries and cobbled together from cultures and empires all over the world. I learned how much Asia, through the Mongols and Kublai Khan, and Africa through the Egyptians and then later the Moors had influenced European history and thought. I learned about the economic impact of the slave trade on Europe and the Americas and how central it was to the ascendancy of the United States as a world power. Anyone ever heard of King Power? Here's a couple of stats, just to blow your mind. On the eve of the Civil War, raw cotton constituted 61% of the value of all U.S. products shipped abroad. 61% of all exports. Also, by the late 1850s, cotton grown in the United States accounted for 77% of the nearly 800 million pounds of cotton used in Britain, 90% of the 192 million pounds used in France, 60% of the 115 million pounds used in Germany, 92% of the 102 million pounds used in Russia. That's a lot of cotton. All born on an economic system of cheap labor. This information, the majority of which I learned outside of my curriculum for my undergraduate studies, gave me a different understanding of who I was in the world and who I was in this country. It also gave me a different understanding of who my white counterparts were. Like Malcolm X's experience as he traveled on his Hajj to Mecca, my studies, and especially my study abroad experience, changed how I saw myself and how I saw my country. I began to see white people as not people to be feared. I began to see white people as not just the creatures of a system that negatively impacted my life in many ways. I saw white people as suffering from the same system in so many ways, both known and unknown. You see, I read Lincoln's debates with Stephen Douglas about slavery and what its expansion meant, not for black people, but for white people. I understood the economic impact of cheap labor and how it depressed wages for all workers. Thank you, my economics degree. I saw how race and racism was created as a construct to satisfy the social capital needs of poor white Southerners, while leaving their economic and political capital coffers empty. I also learned how it was used in the North in a similar fashion with the immigrant classes. I learned a lot about overcoming fear and learning to love through fear. And once I understood, I sought to understand more. I learned that racism is not only prejudice against a certain race due to the color of a person's skin, as many of us have been taught. I learned that racism is both prejudice combined with social and institutional power. It's a system of advantage and disadvantage based on someone's color. The editors of the Webster's Dictionary have learned this fact this year and are currently revising the definition. And the more I researched, the more I learned about how we can change the system as individuals. And I want to share with you the 3 keys that I discovered during that time that have helped me to make a positive impact on race relations wherever I go. The first key, I learned that just because you don't understand, that doesn't mean that the subject is not understandable or it doesn't make sense. You see, I realized and I learned that this type of thinking, where we begin to displace the fact that we can't understand something onto the person who's making the argument, is a defense mechanism against shame and embarrassment for not understanding. I learned that this is also a block to empathy. It's a block to us being able to see the world from the other person's point of view. Because you can't learn what you already know the answer to. And you can't learn when you start the conversation with a conclusion. Now, I learned this because I engaged in conversations with people on topics that I couldn't understand and that were not understandable. It didn't make sense to me that someone couldn't understand the pain that was inflicted by the Confederate flag until I spoke to one of my students who flew the flag and explained to me how the flag was, for him, symbolic of his heritage. And when I learned about the history of what had happened during the war and after the war, it made sense to me from his perspective why that would be something that would be important to him. It didn't change my position, but it gave me a starting place to have the conversation to him about how the flag affected me and affected people like me. It created the space for the dialogue. When I had discussions with people about affirmative action, and I couldn't understand how they couldn't see
that in a land where the laws literally kept black people from serving equally in the United States Marine Corps, that I was a proud officer in until 1942. I couldn't understand how people couldn't see that we needed to do something to rectify that. But then I understood and I listened to them talk about the stories that they had and how they had been told that certain people had not gotten seats in college because they lost it out to a black person. And that narrative created enmity in them. And it created the space for us to have a conversation about the other seats in college that are reserved for people that generally look just like them. The seats that are reserved for athletes, the majority of whom are not African American. The seats that are reserved for legacy students, people who get to go to the university just because they have someone in their family that went to the university, regardless of whether or not they have the top grades, regardless of whether or not they have the top SAT scores. Those seats, just as equally as the affirmative action seats that people feel may have been taken from them, could have been given to them. But there's just one category of that group that they've been taught to be against, to be angry with. And we were able to have those discussions because I came at it from a position of trying to understand and realizing that I didn't understand, not that it wasn't understandable. And these are the same conversations that I'm having with people who have different perspectives on police violence. As a jiu-jitsu instructor, as a Marine, I have been taught in policing tactics, and I teach policemen and others how to defend themselves. And one of the interesting things about it is I could understand, once I spoke with police officers about the fear, the real fear that they have, for numerous reasons, not the least of which that many of them don't receive a lot of training in how to non-violently de-escalate situations, while still maintaining control of their weaponry. In situations like that, I'm able to understand what they think, and because of that, I'm able to see where the space is for communication. So step one, or key number one, is understanding that just because you don't understand, that doesn't mean it's not understandable. Key two, you have to be able to define success. You see, before you try to improve anything, and definitely before you begin to tell someone how they should try to fix it, you must first define success. You must know what you want. We're not qualified to discuss solutions with anyone until we know what we want. Only then can we tell if we are all trying to go into the same direction. Only then can we know what we're for instead of just what we're against. So often we have discussions about what we're against, and that's where our arguments lie. But very rarely do we actually talk about what we're for. And so when we figure out what we're for and what we want, it allows us to find win-win scenarios. It allows us to find situations where both of us can get what we want, instead of one party having to win and the other party having to lose. The third key is to seek first to understand and then to be understood. You see, in order to love someone, in order to help someone, in order to truly make a difference in someone's life, you must first know what they want. It doesn't matter what your intentions are. If you have great intentions and you give someone medicine because they're sick and they die, you can only make yourself feel better by talking about your intentions when you gave them the wrong medicine. It doesn't help the person that you're trying to help that you meant to give them the right medicine. And this is especially problematic if they were telling you at the time that the medications you were giving them were the wrong medications. You see, it doesn't matter what our intentions are. It matters whether we get the results that we're trying to get. Now, that doesn't mean that you have to give up what you want, or that what you want doesn't matter. But the whole key is you first must seek to understand before you seek to be understood, before you seek to act. This is why we have to create a safe space for the other person to be willing to listen and for the other person to be willing to engage with us, to create a scenario where everybody can win. And that is how we love our neighbors as ourselves. It doesn't mean you sacrifice yourself for your neighbor. No, it means that you focus on solutions where you can both win, and that you don't throw your hands up in frustration when those solutions aren't easy or readily available, and when you don't quite understand. So in closing, I implore you, at whatever stage of the journey you are on, to learn how to love when you're afraid, to remember the God that we serve, and remember the words of the Tori Kelly song that's linked to this broadcast. The lyrics say this: I want to love so high that you cannot get over. I want to love so wide that it'll take forever just to get around. I want a love that doesn't come cheap. It takes everything to make love more than a dream. When you don't know what to do, and it seems like fear and anxiety and overwhelm are pushing you to turn off the news, to stay in your bubble, and to leave that problem to someone else to fix, just pray this simple prayer. Lord, help me to love the way that you love me, and believe that you serve a God that can teach you to show mercy, even to those you may fear. Because I want you to remember that American dream story that I told you to begin with. That is also the truth. That is a life where I learned to love even in the face of fear. And you can have that life too. And that's how we can make racism a thing of the past. God bless you all. And I pray that you have a mercy-filled rest of your week.